I spent 3 days cooking for 14 people on Thanksgiving, and ate every single bite alone. The turkey had gone into the brine the night before. I'd been using my mother's method since I was 22. Cold water, brown sugar, kosher salt, and a handful of fresh thyme left overnight in a plastic bucket in the garage. The November chill doing what a refrigerator couldn't quite manage. I'd set my alarm for 5:30 so I could get it into the oven by 6. My husband was still asleep when I slipped out of bed, and I remember thinking, very clearly, that I would let him sleep in. That was the kind of wife I still believed I was. By 7, the house smelled like roasting sage and browning butter. By 10, the sweet potato casserole was in. By noon, the cranberry relish was done. The one with the orange zest and a splash of bourbon that my mother had made every year of my life, and that I'd only recently learned by heart instead of from the page. Dinner rolls proofed and waiting. The good china was out. The cloth napkins were folded into fans, which I'd practiced twice in October after watching a cooking show. Because I'd wanted everything to be exactly right. 14 sets of silverware, 14 glasses. My husband's parents driving up from 3 hours south, his aunt and uncle, 4 cousins between them, his younger sister, his sister, not mine, though I'd made the mistake 11 years ago of loving her the way you love family, and had not been corrected in that mistake until it was far too late. My college roommate and her husband rounding out the table. Because I've always believed Thanksgiving should extend past blood. At 2 o'clock I carried the turkey to the sideboard, because I'd timed everything to be ready at 2. And everyone had confirmed they'd be there by 2. At 2:30 I began calling people. My mother-in-law answered on the 3rd ring. The pause after she heard my voice was short but specific. The pause of someone recalibrating what they'd been told to expect. "Honey," she said slowly, "Craig told us you called it off." I had to grip the edge of the counter. "He said you hadn't been feeling well." Her voice had gone careful and soft, the particular softness people use when they're not certain of the ground they're standing on. "He was very worried about you. He said you'd been struggling, that you needed a quiet holiday." "He said that?" "He called Tuesday. Said you'd made the decision yourself." A pause. "We didn't want to push if you needed rest." I told her there had been a miscommunication. I said I was fine. I kept my voice warm, and I set the phone down when we hung up, and pressed both palms flat against the granite, and waited for the shaking in my hands to stop. He had called her Tuesday. I'd been making pea crusts on Tuesday. 2 pumpkin, 1 pecan, while he sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and his phone. I remembered him laughing at something on his screen. I had thought he was watching a video. I looked at the table, at the 14 fans of cloth napkins, at the steam still rising off the food I'd spent 3 days preparing. I sat down at the head of the table, in my own chair, and I looked at the empty seat to my left where my husband was supposed to be. And I thought about everything I had spent 11 months choosing not to know. The first sign had been his phone, face down always, in a way it hadn't been before. Small enough to explain. He was trying to be more present, I'd told myself. He'd read something about screen time. The calls from his sister had increased gradually, until she was ringing him 3 or 4 times a day. I had told myself she needed her brother. I had been the one to encourage him to be there for her after her breakup. I had been thoughtful and trusting, and I had been, it turned out, very convenient. The recipes had been harder to rationalize. My mother passed away 27 months before that Thanksgiving. She left behind a spiral notebook, with a cracked green cover. And pages warped by years of steam and spatter. The handwriting so familiar to me that looking at it for longer than 30 seconds at a time made it hard to breathe. Her potato soup, her chess pie, her brisket, which took 12 hours and needed coffee. Yes, coffee. Added at the 4-hour mark, and which she had made for every significant occasion of my life from childhood through the day I got married. I'd kept the notebook in a box in the garage. I hadn't been ready to find a permanent place for it yet. Grief has its own timeline, and I was still on mine. 8 months before Thanksgiving, my college roommate had texted me a link with a note. "Isn't this your sister-in-law's blog? Small world." The blog belonged to my husband's sister. I recognized my mother's brisket by the 3rd sentence of instructions, the specific directive about rendering the fat slowly before the sear. The coffee at hour 4. The instruction about and how to use it rather than fight it. Every detail was my mother's. Not the exact words, which had been shuffled around, but the knowledge underneath them, the specific sequence of understanding that you only have if someone stood next to you and taught you. 11 of the 14 recipes on that blog had come from my mother's notebook. I had taken a screenshot and closed the tab and not opened it again, because opening it again meant something I wasn't ready to face. I had told myself coincidences happened. I had kept the notebook in the garage. Then, 8 days before Thanksgiving, my neighbor knocked on my door at 7 in the morning. Agnes has lived next door since, before we bought the house. She is 72 years old, retired after 34 years as a school librarian, which produces a specific kind of person, one who notices everything, says exactly what needs to be said, and cannot be talked out of telling you the truth when she has decided you need to hear it. She was standing on my porch in her bathrobe, with a cup of coffee in one hand, and her phone in the other, and she had the look she gets when she's carrying something that belongs to you. "I've been sitting on this for 2 weeks, she said, because I kept hoping I was wrong. She'd installed a video doorbell the previous year, after someone took a package off her porch. The camera has a wide angle that covers her driveway, and a portion of the street in front of both our houses. From where it's mounted, it also captures the curb directly in front of my home." She handed me the phone. The video was timestamped 3 weeks earlier, a Saturday evening. I watched my husband's car pull up along the curb, not our driveway, not anywhere I'd have noticed from inside the house. I watched him and his sister get out on opposite sides of the car. I watched them stand together in the early dark between the door and the hood. And then I watched him take her face in both his hands. I watched it 3 times. "There are 4 more, Agnes said quietly. "Different nights. The earliest one is from June. June. 7 months at minimum." I handed the phone back to her and sat down on her porch steps, because my legs had stopped cooperating. Agnes sat down beside me and didn't rush me. She went inside and made a second cup of coffee and put it in my hands. Somewhere in the next hour, she told me about her own first marriage. About the things she'd explained away and the signs she'd learned to look past. And how she'd wished for years that someone had knocked on her door the way she was knocking on mine, early enough that she could still do something with the information. "I wasn't sure if it was my place," she said. "It was," I told her. I asked if she'd noticed anything else. She had. His car had been parked in that same spot, slightly out of sightline of our front windows, at least a dozen times since June, sometimes for several hours. Once, in September, when I'd been in Atlanta for a work conference, she'd seen his sister's car in our driveway. September. I'd called him from my hotel room both nights I was away. He'd sounded tired. He said he'd gone to bed early. I walked back to my own house and sat down at the computer and logged into our joint Chase account, for the first time in longer than I was comfortable admitting. My husband had absorbed our household finances gradually over the years. The way these things happen. A division of labor that started practical and became permanent. He paid the bills, reconciled the statements, filed our taxes in April. I ran a freelance accounting practice that took most of my organizational attention, and I told myself it made sense for him to handle ours. I had trusted him with this the same way I'd trusted him with most things. Completely, without much thought, because nothing had given me reason to think otherwise. The first transfer had gone out in January. $450, coded with a reference number I didn't recognize, sent to an external account I had no information on. There were 14 more after it. I did the math twice. $11,280, moved in amounts ranging from $400 to $900, timed at monthly intervals, each just under the threshold that would have triggered an automatic notification. 15 months, each one coded to look, at a glance, like a routine bill payment. I sat with that number for a long time. Then I went to the garage and opened the box where my mother's notebook lived. It was there, but it was upside down, and I don't put it back upside down. I carried the notebook inside and set it on the kitchen table and called my attorney. She'd been recommended by my college roommate, who'd used her 3 years earlier and said, "She asks questions like a surgeon. She doesn't waste a word. Both of those things were immediately true. By the end of the call she had said, "You've done the right thing calling early. Collect everything. Don't move anything. And don't let him know you know." For the next 8 days, I brined a turkey. I proofed dinner rolls. I confirmed the guest list with everyone on it. I folded napkins into fans and laid out 14 place settings and behaved, in every visible way, like a woman who still believed her family was coming to Thanksgiving. The group text went out at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. 3 attachments, no caption, no explanation. The first was the clearest clip from Agnes's footage. The one from the Saturday 3 weeks prior. Sharp and unambiguous in the streetlight. The second was a scrolled screenshot of the bank transfer history. 15 months. $11,280. The external account number highlighted. The third was a side-by-side image I had put together myself. A photograph of my mother's notebook open to the brisket recipe, her handwriting visible in the margins, and a screenshot of the blog post with the language rearranged but the knowledge. The specific earned. Inherited knowledge, identical, right down to the coffee at hour 4. I delivered all 3 to the 14-person thread simultaneously, and then I poured a glass of the Pinot Noir I'd been saving for the celebration, and sat back down at the head of the table and waited. My mother-in-law responded in 12 minutes, one line, "Oh my God." My father-in-law called 4 minutes after that. He is a man who has never raised his voice in my presence, who cried at my wedding, who had called me on the anniversary of my mother's passing last year just to say he was thinking of me. His voice on the phone was shaking. "Tell me what you need," he said. "I need you to know the truth," I said. "You have that," he said, "and you have us. We're getting in the car right now." My husband came home at 7:15, which meant he'd been somewhere else for the 5 hours his family was supposed to have been at our table. He came through the garage door, smelling of someone else's kitchen, and he stopped in the doorway when he saw me sitting at the table, with the food still out and the wine open. "You actually cooked," he said. "I told you I was cooking," I said. He checked his phone. I watched the sequence move across his face, confusion, comprehension, then the particular gray pallor of a person who has understood, too late, how badly they've misjudged someone. What followed was long. He moved through denial and into explanations and then into the version where his sister had been the one to pursue him. Which was interesting to me, mainly because it confirmed there was something to have pursued. I let him talk. I had spent 8 days imagining this conversation, and by that point most of the grief had already done its work, and his words arrived at a distance, like sounds from another room. What I kept returning to while he spoke was one specific afternoon the previous fall. Him, sitting at the kitchen table watching me unpack my mother's boxes, watching me pick up the notebook and set it back down, watching me carry it to the garage, because I wasn't yet ready to find it a permanent home. He had witnessed every moment of that. He had seen exactly what that notebook meant. He packed what he needed and left by 9. His parents arrived at 10:40. My mother-in-law in the coat she'd thrown on over her pajamas because they had left immediately. 3 hours of highway in the dark. My father-in-law walked through the door and held on for a moment without saying anything. My mother-in-law looked at the food on the table and said, "Let me get plates." At 11 o'clock on Thanksgiving night, the 3 of us sat down and ate the dinner I'd made, and it was the only part of that entire day that felt like what Thanksgiving was supposed to feel like. The divorce finalized 8 months later. In our state, dissipating marital assets is factored into equitable distribution, and a 15-month paper trail of transfers to a private account is not something that can be made to disappear from a settlement calculation. My attorney was thorough. The house stayed mine. What I recovered financially was most of what had been taken. His sister removed the blog the Monday after Thanksgiving. She sent an email 6 weeks later that I read once and filed away without response. Whatever version of the future she'd been imagining, the reality appears to have been different. I had expected to lose his family. That was not what happened. His parents called every week without fail. They came for Christmas and spent 3 days helping me repaint the living room, the deep sage green I'd always wanted, and my husband had always called too dark. They sat at my kitchen table and talked about their son with the specific, clear-eyed grief of parents who love their child and cannot excuse what that child has done. My mother-in-law said once, about 7 months after the divorce was final, "You were a better daughter to us than he was a husband to you. I want you to know that we know that." I didn't know how to respond. I wrote it down anyway. Agnes brought me soup in February when I had the flu. She brought her doorbell footage to my attorney in December, in a manila envelope with a handwritten note that said, "For what it's worth." It was worth a considerable amount, as it turned out. In the spring, she taught me her mother's apple cake recipe standing at my counter, talking me through each step from memory in the way someone does when they want the recipe to actually belong to you afterward, not just be borrowed. The notebook I had professionally digitized in April. Every page photographed, archived, backed up in 2 places. I sent copies to everyone on my mother's side of the family. By the end of the year, I had a meeting scheduled with a small cookbook editor who was interested in a project built around the notebook. Not just the recipes, but the life recorded around them. Every margin note in my mother's handwriting named someone who had loved which dish, what occasion it had been made for, who'd asked for the recipe afterward. The editor called it a document of care. I thought that was exactly right. A year later, I cooked Thanksgiving again. The table was set for 4. Agnes. Me. 1 turkey, smaller than last year's. The cranberry relish. A chess pie I made from the notebook with Agnes, reading the instructions aloud over my shoulder, because she said she'd never made a chess pie in her life, and what exactly had she been waiting for? My father-in-law said grace. The same words he's used every year I've known him, his version, the one he learned from his own father. And then he added something new at the end. He said he was grateful for the people who show up. He said he meant that to cover a lot of ground this year. He was looking at Agnes when he said it. Agnes was looking at her plate. Every chair was filled. Nobody was sitting in the same seat they would have sat in a year before. Everything was different, and it was also, in the ways that counted, enough. I've spent time since then, thinking about the woman who spent 3 days cooking for 14 people she needed to believe in, who practiced folding napkins into fans because she thought the perfection of the table might protect her from what she already suspected. She had believed, somewhere underneath everything she'd built, that if the cranberry relish was beautiful enough, and the rolls were risen exactly right, the people who were supposed to love her would behave like people who loved her. That effort could stand for evidence that a well-set table was a kind of argument. People don't leave because the relish wasn't right. They leave for reasons that have nothing to do with what you put in front of them. And the people who say day. A woman in her bathrobe at 7 in the morning with a cup of coffee and something difficult to say. A man driving 3 hours in the dark to stand in your doorway. They show up without conditions. Not because the food was perfect, because you matter to them. And that is the whole of the reason, and there is nothing you need to add to it. My mother knew this. It is written in the margins of her notebook, over and over in different forms, in different ink. In the shorthand of someone who cooked for people her entire life, and understood what cooking was actually for. Make extra. There's always room. Someone always brings a friend. There's always enough. I'm still learning to believe that fully. But I'm getting there. One dinner at a time. In a house that is mine, at a table with the right number of chairs. If this story stayed with you, hit that like button right now. The moment that got me was when Agnes handed me her phone, and I realized someone had been paying attention when I thought no one was watching. What moment hit you hardest? Drop it in the comments. And if you want more stories about the people who show up and the ones who finally walk away, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next.